I don't want to change anything. I want to enhance it. And so I had all of this knowledge going in. I said, if you turn to page 24, you're going to see how I would grade a chamber music unit slightly different than how it's currently going. So there's some reference to where I'd like to do. And they were kind of blown away by that. They're used to people just coming in and being like, oh, I'll teach music and, here's some musical things. But you got to do your homework if you want something like this. You got to go after it. And I think that set me apart in that interview.
Welcome to another episode of Contrabass Conversations, your show covering life on the low end of the spectrum. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and I am so glad to be bringing you today's episode featuring Jonathan Glawe. And I've been a fan of Jonathan's for years. I remember meeting him at the Midwest Clinic years ago in Chicago, and he's somebody I've admired as an orchestra director, as a program builder, and guess what? He's a bassist. In fact, we have so much in common, and we dig into that in this interview and much more. This interview is broken into 3 parts. Part 1, finding your place in the music education world. Part 2, managing your time. And Part 3, the state of music education. Chock full of great takeaways for anybody involved in teaching in any way. I know you're going to enjoy this one. We've got some great sponsors on board. I'd like to thank Upton Bass String Instrument Company and the Bass Violin Shop, and we're going to hear more from them later. You'll also be hearing some excerpts from the Pioneer High School Symphony Orchestra, and there's much more available online. Links to everything are in the show notes. So, Part 1, finding your place in the music education world. And we start off with the experience that Jonathan had, and it's one that I've had as well, transitioning to a new director in a strong established program.
When you take over a program like Pioneer High School, which ultimately came to be when Elizabeth Green came over from University of Michigan and started our program and really developed it over the course of just a few years. She was part-time at the University of Michigan and then developed it into a 60-person ensemble instantly, and then it grew from there. When you have Elizabeth Green as kind of the founder of your program, you have enormous shoes to fill. And then you look at the the people after that. You look at M.J. Quigley Young, who was one of my predecessors, even Gabe Villasserta taught at Pioneer. There's several people who taught along the way who really kind of formed our program into what it is, which is a pretty strong program that cares a lot about excellence in high-level musicianship. And then somebody like me comes in. I'm hired at Pioneer when I'm 26 years old, and I'm a person who has interest in a wide variety of musical styles. I did grow up in the classical realm, but it wasn't until I was in my 20s that I really discovered kind of some other styles that could be put in the classroom. And I was just eager to put anything in front of students. And my big goal was, if I put Twinkle Little Star in front of you, if I put Mingus in front of you, if I put Beethoven 5 in front of you, you got to go after it with the intense passion that this music deserves, whatever it is. I want to be clear though, I've always been, more of a traditional classical player, as well as a musician, but it's these other interests and, knowing the music of the United States and blues and that art form, I think is important to some element, as long as you try to do it with the respect and dignity it deserves. You don't want to try to water it down too much. You want to try to give it the ultimate respect, teach the history of it, teach where it comes from as best you can, bring in experts in the field. Otherwise you're just putting another arrangement in front of them and they have no context. So that's kind of what I meant by that transition, and it was a hard one. I think if I didn't work incredibly hard to try to maintain and protect the integrity of the traditional classical items in my classroom, it wouldn't have worked. But my first heart has always been with more of the traditional Shostakovich, Tchaikovsky, Beethoven, Brahms, so I know a lot about those things. And if I don't know, I take pride in going out and finding those answers.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And Pioneer was not your first job, right? You were out in Connecticut before that for a bit?
Yeah, when I graduated from the University of Kansas, my first thought was, I was gung-ho about music education, and I knew I wanted to teach strings and I knew I wanted to do orchestra, but I didn't know where I wanted to land. So my goal was to teach at every corner of the United States before I settled. So I said, I had no limitations. I did not care. I wanted to move somewhere and start new, learn about the culture of a community. I also wanted to teach at different levels. So a job came up in Darien, Connecticut, of all places. And Darien, Connecticut, it's a community that is really well off. It's about 40 minutes north of New York City. So I moved to Stamford, Connecticut, and I lived there for a while. And then I worked in Darien, Connecticut. So I worked at 3 elementary schools, and elementary strings was my thing. And I thought, this is a great job because as a young upcoming teacher, I'm a bassist, and I'm supposed to be teaching this violin thing. I have every day where I am playing and modeling with these students and working on my craft as well. So at the end of every day, I would practice violin, then viola, then cello for 15 minutes a day, every day, because I knew I needed to get better on these things before potentially I'd go on to another gig. So that was kind of my time to explore. Basically, it was Connecticut was like a giant practice room for me, an exploration of how to play these instruments. And then, of course, 40 minutes from New York City, I'd train down to New York City and I'd get tons of cultural things that just like blew me away. So I would take my iPod 1, my very first iPod, I'd go train down to New York City and I'd walk every Saturday. And then when I'd get to water, I'd turn around and walk some more. And this is how I discovered the Masada String Trio. Do you know this? Do you know this group?
I've got to check them out. No, I'm not familiar.
John Zorn. And I was walking by one day and my iPod was dead and I heard this amazing music coming from this hole in the wall. And I go in and my mind was just blown. So I go back to Connecticut. I start searching for people who are interested in jamming and all that. And so that's kind of where my eclectic styles really started to take off, by just that happenstance of walking by and hearing Masada. And it just went from there. And then I'd have jam parties at my house, and we'd play for 6 or 7 hours every Friday night. And we would have every instrument that we owned laying around in a circle of the room. We'd go to one instrument, we'd play, we'd explore it, go to another instrument, play, explore it. I would coach classical music. One of my jazz friends would coach me in jazz, and it was just a great time. So it was a great exploration. It was like another degree.
Jonathan started off as a gigging bassist, and he continued to gig throughout his training and his jobs. And we talk about this, but also what it's like coming back to the bass, working a job like this full time, how it reinvigorates him, energizes him, and gives him some fresh perspective on the orchestral experience.
I grew up in Waterloo, Iowa, Northeast Iowa, and I was a bassist through and through. I probably gave my high school orchestra director many headaches, but at the same time, I was always asking questions about the music, and, I wanted to be a better bassist. So, I took my first audition with the Waterloo Cedar Falls Symphony when I was 15, and I got that gig, which was wonderful. My mother had to drop me off because I couldn't drive yet for my first gig, that type of thing. And then, I went to University of Kansas, and I couldn't afford to just go through college without making money. So, I was doing all sorts of things. But one of the things I did was I took a job at the Topeka Symphony, and I won a job there. And I learned a lot about playing repertoire through that group. And we played a lot of repertoire that year. And then I'd gig in Kansas City and all that. And it was kind of a nice, refreshing way to enhance what I was learning through college anyway. So, I was going through the, romantic history in my classrooms, 8:30 in the morning in that class, and that night I'd be playing all the romantics, so it was a really nice connection. And that's kind of when I started to get an itch for score study a little bit. So I'd have some, pocket scores with me while I was in rehearsal with Topeka and things like that. And then when I went to Connecticut, I played in the American Chamber Orchestra, which is a really nice community orchestra up there through Connecticut, and they just played a lot of great rep. I love the conductor. I'd go to see the New York Phil, and I'd play around a lot in Connecticut. And once I'd get established, and I'd go somewhere else. So then I went to University of Oregon, and that was part of my journey to see all of the country before I settled down. But it was also, they were offering me money to do some conducting and research string education. So I said that's a wonderful fit. But when I was in Oregon, I was really low on funds. And so I started gigging there too. So Eugene Symphony and Corvallis Symphony. And I was at one point in 6 different groups up there and just playing around everywhere. And I was a gigging bassist. And, none of these groups were, top tier in any regard, but that wasn't the point. These orchestras were so important to their communities and they played great repertoire. So there's no better way to get the repetition there. So then I moved to Ann Arbor, and I'm not known as a bassist in Ann Arbor at all. And that was a very difficult transition for me because people always would call me for gigs for bass all the time because I was reliable. I would practice. I would actually be prepared. I'd be on time. But then in Michigan, none of the bass gigs came. People stopped calling me. They're like, "Oh, you're that guy that's going to take Pioneer High School to the new level, right?" Oh, okay, great. But they didn't even think about me as a bassist. And for some reason, that was challenging for me at first. I don't really know why. It's because, as an instrumentalist, you work so hard on the craft of being a great musician. And then when I'm still that musician, I just have a different part of my job description now. So even to this day, I don't get called for bass gigs as much. I do occasionally. I play in the Dexter Community Orchestra. I've played in some other groups, but I don't get those calls as much because people know how busy I am, and they're afraid I wouldn't be able to fully commit to things. So that kind of makes me sad. But at the same time, whenever I'm having a rough day at school, the first thing I do is I take a bass out during my lunch hour, and I just play some scales or play some excerpts, and it calms me down. And usually after every time I play bass in the morning, my afternoon rehearsals go amazingly. And I don't know what it is, man, but it's just like it settles you down. It just kind of brings you back to earth and provides gravity to the meaning of what you're doing. So it still happens to this day to be able to play and calm you down.
For me, I would play a week with the Elgin Symphony, and then I would notice my school rehearsals getting better. And I'm not sure why. I've thought about that a lot. I'm not sure if part of me thought it was almost like having a little bit of empathy for the students in their chair. Because all of a sudden I'm in the Elgin bass section. I'm in the back. I can't really hear what the conductor's saying. Nobody has a pencil, even though it's Elgin, right? It's just all that same stuff that you struggle with as a teacher, and just being on that flip side. I don't know, but I totally felt what you're describing when I would go back to the instrument. It just it connected me in a really interesting way.
Oh yeah, and when you're sitting in that bass section, you hear things you'll never hear on the podium. Yeah. You hear, you're constantly listening to that tuba player, and if they're a few cents sharp or flat, you got to go to them. You can't fight that, right? All that stuff, and you hear these things, and you see the little conversations happening. And I'm looking at the conductor in the bass section, and they're not noticing any of this. Yeah, they have their own vision and their own things they're working on, which is great. And I love every conductor I've played under. Mostly, but it's. You just get a different, fresh perspective, and it's a beautiful thing to be a part of the actual ensemble. And something else that's really interesting is you watch the conductor and you learn from them. I've been fortunate to play under some really great conductors, and when you are watching them and you're listening to them, you also, when you're a teacher, you're looking for how they treat people and how they treat their musicians, and you discover that the conductors that really try to reach you at a personal level in regards to treating you with professionalism and courtesy, but are also great musicians, are the ones you ultimately want to play for. And it makes you want to be that person. Yeah. And that's the tough line, because when you do high school, they'll come in after an algebra test and they're exhausted, they're tired, and they don't want to be there for a second. And you got to somehow gear them up, and you want to hold them accountable, but nobody wants to just be yelled at all day, So you kind of learn a lot about how to rehearse and create the culture of your classroom by sitting in a section of somebody else's rehearsal.
When you're in that conductor role and you have that inner circle of players in the section and all the eyes are on you, that just has such a different feeling than being in the back. You can't really hear the first violins. You can't hear the conductor that well. You hear the tuba. It's just, it's amazing what those shifts in perspective will do for you as a teacher.
But as you get interested in conducting and you're sitting in the bass section, your eyes are open when you see the conductor working with the violins and how they're doing it. And your brain is thinking, here's how I would do that. I like that. I'm stealing that. And so it just kind of changes your whole perspective. When as you're a young bass player, you're not really thinking about anything but you playing the notes, right? You're just kind of, but when you have some conducting experience, you're just thinking of the whole package. And it's a beautiful thing, I think.
Jonathan's job at Pioneer High School, it's really one of the best jobs in the country in the orchestra education world. And we talk about what Jonathan did applying for that job and strategies that one can implement when applying for a job in general. This is great stuff, folks. You're going to love this.
You apply for this Pioneer job, you get this Pioneer job, you're walking in, Elizabeth Green started the program like you described. And did you have a strategy in mind for that transition? Like what those first few years were going to look like, just in terms of repertoire, keeping things the same, changing things up. Did you have any sort of general strategy?
Absolutely, 100%. And I think it started with preparing for the interview, to be honest with you. And this is something I was hoping to talk about on this podcast because there's a lot of young people looking for jobs and there's some great talent out there. But one thing that I've missed in a lot of my conversations with incoming teachers is that when they go in for interviews, they don't necessarily research enough about the community of where they're going and learning the ins and outs of, what makes the community tick. So, for example, with Ann Arbor Pioneer, I had never been to Ann Arbor. But in preparation for that interview, I was all over the internet. I was calling people who had been through the program. I was talking to former directors, talking to current directors. I was asking questions. I was saying, can I get a copy of your handbook? When was the last time you performed at Midwest? When was the last what are the expectations of your program traveling? I knew all of those things going in. So when I showed up for my interview, I had a handbook for what the future of the Pioneer Orchestra program could be. But I also had one sheets of the differences between where I would like to go and where they currently are. So I handed them out at the interview and I said, here's what your current policy is. Here's where I would like it to go. At the same time, I 100% respect the history and culture of what this program is. And, I just want to be full on the table of what I think could be with this program. I don't want to change anything. I want to enhance it. And so I had all of this knowledge going in. I said, if you turn to page 24, you're going to see how I would grade a chamber music unit slightly different than how it's currently going. So there's some reference to where I'd like to do. And they were kind of blown away by that. They're used to people just coming in and being like, oh, I'll teach music and, here's some musical things. But you got to do your homework if you want something like this. You got to go after it. And I think that set me apart in that interview. So, it starts there. And so even before I got there, but then, of course, you never want to change anything in year one. You really want to just take it and make it better or maintain it, whatever you need to do. So, I was putting in 70, 80 hours a week that first year. Not ashamed to say I was there past midnight several nights. And that was, of course, back when collecting paperwork was collecting paperwork and not an online Google document. So, I had a vision. I knew I didn't want to change anything the first year, but just I had to prove myself as a classical conductor and musician. And so I learned a lot. You can ask anybody in my classrooms, he had a rough first year at times. But nobody, and you could ask anybody, nobody would say I didn't work harder that first year and didn't do it for the right reasons, trying to give them these great opportunities. So my vision, that's kind of how that vision worked.
You heard Jonathan mention those 70, 80-hour weeks and staying past midnight at the job. And the next question, which we dig into in part 2, is what was he doing with those hours? And that leads into a fascinating discussion about what's involved in being an orchestra director running a program like Pioneer High School. So that's part 2, managing your time. And before we get into that, I want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Upton Bass String Instrument Company, one of our sponsors from the very beginning of the podcast. It's so great to have them back on board. And I want to talk today a little bit about the Brescian model, which is the first bass that they got bass geeky on when they really began to refine the Upton basses. So Gary, the founder of Upton, he is from England and he really loves English basses. And most English basses are straight out of the Brescian school. They've got big bodies, deep ribs, tall arches, and violin corners. It's been one of the most commissioned Upton bass models since they released it. It won first place for tone with the playing jury in Copenhagen for Bass Europe. And John Patitucci, the great John Patitucci, he's been a fan of the model, and he has won up in Berkeley and won in South America at the Daniel Perez Foundation. Very cool. Love what Upton's doing, and check them out online at uptonbass.com. Okay, part 2 of our episode. Managing your time. What do you do with that time, those 70 and 80 hours? How can you manage your time, and how can you get parents and students involved in a helpful fashion to take some of that burden off of you? Can you give folks who might not have been in this world that we're talking about, like, just a window into like the magnitude of what you're doing in those long hours?
Okay, it starts with about 20 file cabinets. Okay. And only and about 3 of them where the keys don't work. It starts there.
Lovely, yeah.
And you just figuring out, okay, who has these master keys? Where do I get these keys? I go to the office. Well, we don't have them. We'll go to another office. Like that's 1 hour of your day right there. And then once you get in the cabinets, you're just like, wow, there's this amazing amount of music. It's just unbelievable. You have all the Beethoven symphonies. You have Brahms. You have Shostakovich. You have Tchaikovsky. And the beauty of these parts are they're old. They're crusty paper, like yellow crusty paper, but you look at them closely and they have like 3 or 4 different versions of bowings written above every note. And I learned who Elizabeth Green's bowings were. I learned who MJ Quigley's bowings were. I learned Gabe's bowings. And I learned that this was just an ultimate resource in an archive. So just combing through that to start is just kind of like a kid in a candy store. That's just the music. Then you go into the instrument storage room and you realize, okay, there's big open shelving and there's all these instruments here. Some of them are labeled with a number from the 1960s, and then they relabeled them in the 1980s, and then they relabeled them in the 2000s. And then you look at your database and it only has one of those numbers, and you have to figure out where that is, and you have to kind of start over. And then you go and you look in the parents' closet of all their stuff, and you see things you see like 10 squeegees, and you're like, what's this all about? You realize, oh yeah, they do that car wash every fall, and you'd heard about it, but now it's right in front of you with 20 buckets, and you figure out, who do I need to call to make this happen? And I was very fortunate that one of my predecessors had a big binder of everything they did, and it was in hard copy, and it was wonderful. And I'd go through and I'd look through it, and a lot of it was just so solid, but there were all these names of people I didn't know because I'd never lived in Ann Arbor. So the trick is to kind of comb through that, kind of take the name out and say, I need to find the right person to do this position because I don't know how to contact this person, or this person has graduated with their child. So those are just the generic things. And then setting up the classroom, making sure you have the right amount of chairs and stands. The amount of time you spend just fixing stands, it's trying to find the parts. Oh gosh, man, there's so many things. It's unbelievable. The uniforms. I could go on about uniforms. You open that uniform closet and you're like, okay, I got like 80 size 42 jackets and maybe 5 size 40, and you really need 80 40s. And it's like, so yeah. And then the tour expectation, I had to set up a tour within the first month of being a Pioneer because it was expected to travel. And then our interlocking camp, getting that set up, going up there every summer. Yeah, there's that. So that's kind of the general idea. And then if you've noticed, I haven't even talked about planning for what happens in the classroom.
Right, exactly. And that's the thing that I think people don't realize is like those administrative aspects of that job and the librarian aspects and just everything you're describing. Man, you are taking me back. How do you manage your time, or do you have any strategies for just like dealing with all these different pieces of the puzzle that you might want to share?
it gets better over time. It's you have to start by solving the most urgent matter first. So when you get to class day one and you realize, oh, I'm short 2 cello bows for some random reason, and you're like, okay, I gotta put out that fire instantly. You've got to always reply to the students first as much as you can. You can get easily swamped when you're a young teacher with a lot of energy. You get pulled in a lot of directions. They want you to go do this. They want you to go do that. And early in my career, particularly, I made it clear that I wanted to reply to my students and give work for them first and foremost. And anything else can be figured out later. I think a lot of it is building trust with your parent organization, to be honest with you. It took me a good 7 or 8 years to really build a parent organization that I was incredibly proud of. And I loved all the volunteers I had early on, but they all knew my predecessors, and they knew how things used to be done. And there was an old guard who was good at getting things done in that regard, but they didn't have current students. So I think building trust with those parents, I've had my parent organization board come over to my house for, a thank you celebration, making time to go out to coffee with your president of your organization. And then, of course, building your student orchestra council. And that has been one of the things I'm most proud of in my job at Pioneer. I have a ferocious student board for each of my orchestras. There's 7 or 8 people who are voted in through their peers to help lead the program, and they have expectations. They have expectations to help run fundraisers, help organize fundraisers, help maintain the climate of the room. So if like a student is upset about something and they're kind of afraid to talk to me for whatever reason, I feel like I'm approachable, but they might be able to approach that president, and the president can communicate with me. And, they're very important in that regard. And I've trained them in how to do the library. I've trained them in how to help with uniforms. I've trained them in helping with our instrument storage. So for example, my first year, I spent probably 2 weeks doing inventory at the end of the year, and it's pretty much all me and maybe 1 or 2 other people. This past week, I did all of my instrument, uniform, and music library inventory in the course of 3.5 days. And that was simply because I had every member of my orchestra council volunteer 1 hour of their time during their finals week. I had 5 parents coming to help with uniforms, and I had a co-director who helped me with the instrument storage situation, and I got it all done. And so I've taken it from that 2-week thing down to basically a 3.5 day process. And I cannot be more proud of what my students do. And what they get back, they see me working hard for them. They also get a wonderful letter of recommendation, and those types of things. And the rewards continue to come back. And we have a thank you pizza party. It's great. So put people to work. That's my advice.
Yeah. Well, and what a great way to put people to work and delegate those tasks out to, like you're describing, to the parent organization. And I just love how you've implemented this student leadership component, right? I mean, that's something that I worked as best as I could at, to varying degrees of success. And I
right.
love, and I think that's one of those things that people, they know that getting the students involved is so helpful. It gives them ownership of the program to a great extent, and it helps you as the director. Like, did it evolve for you? Were you just out of the gate running like you are now, or or do you have any advice just on how to start implementing that?
Yeah. So the student leadership situation, there's different kinds of leaders in your classroom. There are times you need a musical leader, and the section leaders, in my opinion, their job should be mostly about music, helping coordinate bowings, helping put fingerings in parts. I kind of lean on them for those things, because at the level that we have at Pioneer High School, having me try to establish violin fingerings in, 8th position makes no sense.
Right, yeah.
So, and we also have professional community leaders who help me with that. But so I think the musical leaders are different than the council leaders. And the beautiful thing about having an orchestra council is there's some players in that group who may never become concertmaster or may never go on in music, but they are very organized. They're very kind. They know how to talk to people. And that's their role. They can do that. They can be the president of our concert orchestra and freshmen will come up to them and talk to them. My president of my concert orchestra for several years now, I've had 2 different presidents in a row. At the beginning of the hour, if there's any announcements, they're up doing them before I even ask them to do them. They walk around, they say hi to the freshmen. The freshmen come up to the president and ask, "Can I go to the bathroom?"
Wow.
Because they know that person has their best interest in mind. And, fostering that is, it's really fun. And there's just some people that can sit in the middle or back of a section who are just going to be enormous leaders in this world and just have such kind hearts. And these are their moments to shine. And so that's what I look for there. And advice to do that, one thing I would say is when you implement a student council, you need to be very positive. You need to help and nurture them along the way. But you can't take over their job. If you give them a job, it's their job to follow through. One example is we had a bowling party about, 4 years ago. And the student was insistent that, okay, bowling party, I set it up, it's all good. And I said, "Are you sure?" Because normally I would have cut you a check by now to pay for the deposit. And she said, "Nope, it's all good." Show up. We were not on the book-it. And we had 120 people wanted to bowl. And so, but I let it happen. And it worked out somewhat in the end. But in a way, and I hate to say this, you have to let your council explore and possibly fail, because that is what life's about. You take a job, you take a responsibility, you are insistent it's working, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And how many times, Jason, have you and I done things that we've tried and just doesn't work, but we learn from it, right?
Right, exactly.
So, I think it's important to let your council fail once in a while. And I know that sounds terrible, but it gives them that, okay, wow, I messed up. I'll fix it next time. Here's what I learned from that. So that's important. When you delegate, you got to get out of the way. If not, you're taking on more projects.
In terms of musical leadership, like section leaders, how do you pick those people? Is it by audition, or how does that process work?
Well, for me, in regards to choosing your musical leaders, it's a fairly rigorous process. Ultimately, I think a rotation of seating sets the group up for success more than anything. It cuts the tension out of the room as well. But at the same time, there are certain events in the year where you need the strongest musician in that chair. And then there's other times you also need one of the strongest communicators in that chair, to be honest with you. Sometimes your best musicians have no idea how to communicate with their section, and you have to train that. And you spend most of your time, you see this beautiful playing, but then working and nurturing them to communicate their vision. So how do I choose that? I have a seating audition process. I do believe in that because it is also accountability check, to be honest with you. But I regularly each year have probably, 4 or 5 people in each section that could potentially lead. And, you find the right times for that. We have for our concerto concert, when some of those top players often win a solo opportunity, that's a new opportunity for somebody else to lead a section. And you can kind of put them through the trial with a concerto competition or the concerto concert. For our fall string orchestra performances, sometimes we do something conductorless. Maybe that's an opportunity to try somebody out in that chair and you rotate in that situation. Now, there are often times also where I have somebody who is just clearly above and beyond almost anybody in a section. And the rotation at that point, you wonder, okay, I still believe in this vision, but it's obvious to everyone in the room that this person deserves to be there. And that's when you decide as a teacher, am I nurturing everybody by leaving that person in the leadership position, or should I give somebody else a chance? And so I try to do that. My last concert of the year, I try to reward a senior who has not led before to lead in that last concert. I try to do the same thing at our music camp at Interlochen. At Interlochen, I have one of my top musicians on the stand with somebody from one of my lower 2 ensembles in every section as much as I can. So there's mentorship happening. And then, it's not just about building your principal players, it's about building the outside rows too. I've learned long ago that if you just go 1, 2, 3, 4 down the line in regards to level or skill based on an audition, that there's going to be holes in your ensemble. You got to strengthen your outer row. So, I actually build my shell. I don't go 1, 2, 3, 4. I look for people who have great bow division to put on the outside, and maybe I'll put them with somebody who needs to see great bow division, that type of thing. So yeah, there's not a one formula for me, to be perfectly honest. And I just don't believe in one formula because people change and the classroom needs change.
Managing your time, enlisting the help of the parents and the students, building your shell. So many great takeaways from Jonathan about building a program. I love it. And we're going to dig in part 3 into the state of music education in general. Kind of 2 discussions we're going to have in this final part. And before we get into that, I want to give a shout out to the Bass Violin Shop. They've been a wonderful sponsor of ours, and they offer so many great things. They're located in the southeastern United States in North Carolina, and they offer the Southeast's largest inventory of basses. It's laminate basses, hybrid basses, and carved double basses. So whether you're in search of the best laminate, the best entry-level bass, or you're looking for a fine pedigree instrument, there's always a unique selection ready for you to try. They do trade-ins, consignments, those are all welcome, and you can check them out online at bassviolinshop.com. So we start part 3 here with a discussion about the Midwest Clinic. And if you're not familiar with this event, it's the world's largest band and orchestra clinic. And Jonathan and Pioneer High School will be appearing. Pioneer High School will be performing at the 2017 Midwest Clinic. This is a big deal. This is a huge honor. And it's something that I was fortunate enough to do with my high school orchestra back in 2015. So we chat about this experience and why Jonathan is looking forward to this event.
I wouldn't have applied if I didn't think the orchestra presence was ramping up in a positive way. I think, if you're going to try for something, you want to make sure it's a value for your students, and, for me, I want my students to be able to play in a great location, to have a great clinic, to be inspired by something. Those are some of the things that I look for. And I've been convinced through the current board, that orchestra is really starting to ramp up there. And with the directors I met and the quality of those programs, I really think that Midwest is going to be booming with orchestra in the near future. There might be 300 bands that apply, but there might be 25 full orchestras that apply. And so I think the numbers were up this year for applications, which is wonderful. But I think part of it is directors want to know that their students are getting something really positive out of it. And I personally love where this is going. I love the other full orchestra that's going. I think they're tremendous. Part of one of the things I am insisting on is that my group be able to see the other full orchestra. They'd be able to see the Chicago Symphony at night. That they'd be able to participate in a clinic of some sort. And I'm positive about the direction of where it's going. And I think it's never going to be equal in regards to band and orchestra, but I believe in the vision of what they have for the strings. And the people particularly who are on the board now care a lot about orchestra. And they actively sought to find me out and ask me what I think the future of this clinic should be in regards to orchestra. And I think that's wonderful. They're eager to make it happen. So again, I'm excited to put it through the filter, and I'm excited to try it and see what happens. And, it might be something that I'm going to want to do every 4 years for the rest of my career. We'll find out, I guess.
We wrap up today's episode. And by the way, I will be at that Pioneer High School Midwest Clinic performance. I love going to the Midwest Clinic, and I love checking out groups like Pioneer High School. And congratulations to them and to everything that they're doing and Jonathan's doing. And it's a group effort to get to something like this for sure. So very cool, and congratulations. And we're going to wrap up today with Jonathan's trip to Sweden. He represented the United States in this global music education conference. So we finish up today just chatting about the state of music education globally.
The symposium was in Stockholm, Sweden, and there were 5 different countries that were represented: Norway, Finland, London, Sweden, America, and I think there was another. I'm sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head right now. But it was a way to get together and discuss the current climate and state of music education in their countries. And it was eye-opening what we discovered. In London, the way they teach music education is basically they have, the general classroom teachers in the elementary school, and they are expected to teach songs, but they don't have any training in music, but they're expected to teach music through they might have like one day a month where they get together and they learn some songs, and then they go teach them to their general classroom, which is interesting. Then there's other places where there's just music is outside of the school day. And then other places where, they start playing them on stringed instruments in first grade, and they have, 2 lessons a week in group classes, and they just sound these tremendously amazing programs like in Finland, but it's only, 5% of the whole population of the school that does that. So we just discovered in general, I think, just how fortunate we are in America for what we have. And, it's just the fact that in Ann Arbor public schools, for example, 100% of our students can play an instrument at no cost to them in the 5th grade just blows everybody's mind. It's because that's a financial investment as well as a time investment that a community has to have. And I think the other countries that they struggle with that whole idea of financially investing in the arts. They believe in it, but that's where the line is drawn. And so as I look at that and I look around the United States and where I've taught in Connecticut and growing up in Iowa and Kansas and Oregon and now Michigan, it's, every community has some type of music education happening to different levels of success, of course, but we are incredibly fortunate to have what we have. And as we always fight for more and for protection of those things, I still think it's important to remember just how fortunate we are compared to the rest of the world. That's kind of what I would say.
Jonathan, thank you so much for being on the show. It was so great to catch up with you. And folks, check out links to everything that he's up to, that Pioneer High School is up to, and that we talked about in the show notes. And that's going to wrap up today's episode. If you're new to the podcast, subscribe to the podcast. You can go to iTunes, you can go to Stitcher. We've got an app for it. And all those links can be found at contrabassconversations.com/subscribe. So I'd love to have you follow along in this weekly conversation about all things bass, music, education, mindset, personal development. It's all stuff that I find interesting and that I'm using in my journey to become a better bass player, a better teacher, better person, I guess. And I love having people along on this journey with me, and I'd love to hear from you. If you have not been in touch in a while, or if you've never been in touch, reach out to me, feedback@contrabassconversations.com. Suggest a guest, suggest a topic, or just say hi. That's cool too. You can find us everywhere that you might be, social media, Facebook, Twitter, that sort of thing, Instagram. And if you enjoyed this episode and you want to help out the podcast, here's what you can do. Share this episode. Share it on Facebook. Share it on Twitter. Share it out via email. Just forward it to somebody that you know. Suggest it to a friend if you're on a gig, or to a fellow student if you're a student, or a fellow colleague if you teach somewhere or play somewhere. That would be wonderful. I would be so appreciative. And we've got all sorts of stuff in store for you coming up this fall. Big plans in the works, kind of like usual. But I've got some new things I can't wait to talk about coming up here in the next few weeks. But that's going to do it for another episode of Contrabass Conversations. We will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.